Okay. Anyone who's been to UWC knows the importance of the role that snowball. And given that this is a symposium on black authorship, I'm not sure whether the color coding is right. We should call it a black ball or the suit ball. How important that is for one's own psychological well-being in training. The snowball, if anyone doesn't know, is this lovely unhealthy cake pastry that we have at VALS at the university, and that helps you to navigate supervisor feedback, that helps you navigate supervisor arrogance, and more importantly, just helps you to try and manage your students on a day-to-day. So if the symposium gets too hectic during your break, we can happily send you to the area at VALS. I'll direct you there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to speak. I am from the Department of Psychology, even though I've recently been disavowed by every psychologist in the room. And so I have three things I wanted to do this morning. One was to talk a little bit about my own shaping of what shaped me in doing being a psychologist, and how that shaping of being a psychologist and a supervisor and a potential mentor led to the way that I do or have done supervision over the past little while, and that also the challenges and the sense of alienation that has come from some of that. And then I will talk a little bit about some of the training and supervision that we've done at UWC using the case histories of some of our successful students. And then lastly, just to talk a little bit about life beyond the inward gaze, which is so often the primary place that we go to as psychologists. We are a reflective group, and so our work generally says psychology is about internal well-being and the unconscious and the demons. And so rather than being the Lone Ranger that Kupana was talking about, I'll be the Tanto, because that's really someone that I identify a lot more with. Okay. So I trained at a time when at a time when it was still required for me to apply for permission to the Minister of Home Affairs to study at a university that is white. I studied at WITS in 1986, and at that time the context was one in which there were very few black psychologists who were students being trained in advanced studies in psychology. There were three classes before me, and each year in the three classes there was one black student who was being trained in the year 1984, two in 1985. I was a black student in 1986, and in 1987 there were six students, and the university had a whole lot of difficulties around training students, given that it was breaking the mold of what was acceptable in terms of the quota. At the time, the context of 1986 was the schools boycott, the state of emergency, and during that time, there was quite a disjuncture for me as a black student coming from teaching, from a teaching background, teaching in Kliptown, where the police and the army were at the school as teachers, firstly in uniform and coming to school in their Caspers, and then at the same time having students have demonstrate their abhorrence of the apartheid and the apartheid system. And so coming from that period, we had a whole lot of teachers who were arrested in 1984 and 1985. Who then were in jail for a year and 7 months. One of them, who was later to be one of the teachers, is Ronnie Swartz, who was a DG for education in the Western Cape. And I was really lucky that I had applied for the selections. I managed to get in. And one of the questions in the selections was that you are really quite keen to be an activist. You see yourself as using your psychology to the benefit of the broader society. So how do you see psychology in terms of yourself, in developing yourself as a clinician on a one-to-one for that interior journey? I obviously had given an answer that got me into the course, but I wasn't sure that I was quite honest about it. I think I fudged it. And so coming from that period, I was really lucky to miss being in jail in 1980 because I went to write my Unisa teacher's exam. And so when the school was raided, I wasn't at school. And so was lucky enough not to be with Ronnie and others for a long time. And so having this experience, and I think what the linkage for me in terms of this experience to the training is coming into an institution where the discipline itself did not speak to my own lived experience of being a black person growing up in South Africa. And so how to try and have a way to integrate that sense of myself, of my experience of thinking about psychology in a different way, to the way that it was being done in the textbooks. And I needed to know the textbooks. I did my studies through Unisa, so I definitely had to make sure I knew what to do around the fundamental seminal work around psychology, but it didn't always fit for me. And so in coming into campus, I was in a class of really very, very nice and kind students, but who had a very different way of being. They were students who were, and who I coalesce and work and connect with very, very well, who were from working with OESA, which was an organization that was opposing apartheid. They were worked with, there were supervisors at the university or in the department who worked with youth who were affected by violence, who were being worked in Duduza, which was under fire at that time. And so I was lucky in a sense to be able to have a system or a department that had some elements that I could anchor my own views with. And the disjuncture was quite huge. So we'd have class in the morning around child development, and then in the afternoon I would go to, with the permission of my supervisor, my clinical supervisor, would go to Alexandra, where I had worked and had friends before, and there was a funeral to go and commemorate at a funeral. Asking permission to leave, and the supervisor at the end of the day would call me to check that I was fine. Now, that's a really different experience that one would have had of having a care around this split. The next day in the class, we would talk a little bit about Rorschach and try and find a way to have that very valuable assessment methodology. But there was something else that was going on in the streets outside. And I think straddling these two worlds is something that, as time went on, raised two or three things. One is about where does one fit? Where do I fit as a adherent of the Black consciousness philosophy in a white institution, in a discipline that looks largely at the interior world of someone, of individuals, while at the same time my own lived experience and gaze was outside in the context. And I think that is one element that I think at UWC and in the training on SISA, which was born here at UWC, has consistently had as a different way of looking at things. The power dynamics of supervisors are very clear, right? Their students come to us, we assess them. Those students who are here from UWC and who have trained here know that at the end of each term you have feedback. And you really start pooping quite a lot because you're not sure what that feedback is going to be, an assessment of your internal world, your readiness, your intellectual ability, and also whether you fit the mold of what is the traditional analytic clinician on the couch. In the research area of our departments, I imagine the same kind of thing. What kind of intellectual knowledge you have. And I think what seems to be missing for us, and certainly was for me in my training, but also I think something that I replicated as a trainer, is that there was not as much of an awareness to the history and the baggage people brought. Now, as a psychologist, I should know better because I've come from that system, and I think it's something that's become more and more aware of. The dynamics of power are, in my training, were very clear. I had one egalitarian, very supportive, thoughtful supervisor, and I had a research supervisor who was, by all intents and purposes, someone who made his career on the back of black people, in terms of the scholarship, in terms of the work that they were doing, and that wasn't very helpful for me in my academic career. The transparency around this was, with complaints to the university system, and I'm in one of those, we really close ranks when students question the value of our assessments of them. So when my thesis was being examined, my supervisor picked a fight with the department. I was telling the department that he's surprised about how poorly my training in research methodology is. This is my supervisor. At the examination stage, which is at the committee level, none of this was, the transparency wasn't there, so none of this was communicated to me. And so I'm waiting for the results to come out, and then realize that there's been a third examiner who passed it, and the chair of the committee then decided that that wasn't okay, needed a fourth examiner who was the supervisor. And so, all intents and purposes, it added another two more years of internally before I could pass and graduate. Well, that didn't matter too much because I really tried to avoid my thesis for years, so I can't really blame the university too much. But the point is that these systems are of themselves really replicate oppressive patterns, and that there usually is nothing that the student can do about that too much, both at the university, but I think also more importantly that it can also in the internship, and that's something that I think in our conversations we will raise, because as our department as UWC, we have our interns at some of the internship sites, and sometimes they have really very abusive experiences in the supervision in these sites. All right, so in trying to marry the individual and the collective, this is where I think in terms of our own, in terms of clinical training at UWC, there sometimes is a mismatch. So there's a greater appreciation now of making sure that we are contextually aware, our training matches what is required within a society, because we're training people for the society. But then after that, we don't have posts, so then people have to do private practice to be able to at least earn a little money. And there, we have a very strong ethos of that the analytic mode is the gold standard. And that being involved in community is really not really that helpful, because you are blurring the boundaries. I don't believe in that, and I think I want to raise this. Some of these training challenges, I mean, I think there can be an integrative way that one does uses a theoretical model, both that comes from psychology, but also from more widely, and Kupano spoke about this in terms of the creative around art and history and music, although I would say we should rather listen to the work of Bob Marley than Kanye West, given Kanye West's misogyny. But, you know, that's a different matter. That's a Kupano-Umesh battle. So in terms of our training challenges, and let me go to that, I want to use three different cases of three different students who we trained at the university. And the first the challenge is a student who we trained who's a political activist as a psychologist. He came here in similar ways that I would imagine I came into psychology myself, and wanted to make a difference. There were two difficulties. One was that we have, in terms of our training model and requirement from the Health Professions Council, a certain level of competency that, and training standards. And he didn't meet those. So he was extended. And the extension had with it a difficulty because you have your trainees, your trainers who are black psychologists, who are in a department that prides itself in being contextually aware, and who you're feeling victimized by because they are saying that you don't understand what you're doing. What was a gap in our awareness, and I think it's something that we do ongoingly, and I think our conversation today may help us to find a way to navigate this, is that we were not addressing the history that the individual was coming with inside. And prying that history that was embedded on many experiences of trauma and politically related trauma would be very difficult for the student. We encourage our students to go for therapy so that they can have a space where they can work, but it's just impossible financially to do that. We don't have low-fee clinics, and yes, we do try and find a way to ask our colleagues to be able to see our students in therapy, but it doesn't always help because it's just financially prohibitive. And yet that emotional work, the emotional labor that I was speaking about in the first slide, that emotional labor and that emotional work needs to be done to bring the person into a safer space so they can talk and work with the areas that they need to work with. Our student at one of our fun events had, and I noticed for the first time that he had a bullet hole on his chest. And it only in a conversation with him at the end of his training in the M1 when we went to have a snack at Ocean Basket, was he able to say that he was almost killed because they tried to assassinate him. And none of this in 10 months of training with once a week supervision and group supervision came out. And so really we need to find a way certainly to be able to address that for the supervisee, and that's for him, and as well as for the supervisor in the way that I spoke about my own experiences. The second is a refugee psychologist, and here the tensions are even much more difficult. So we have a wonderful psychologist now who is the chief psychologist in New Zealand in the south, and he does wonderful work. He's a refugee from Rwanda and who did magnificent work. He worked as a psychiatric nurse at Falkenberg Hospital and would come in the morning exhausted. And so we would say, you need to attend to your work, what you think is going on, why you not working. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. But we were not as aware till later that he worked a full-time job at Falkenberg at night to come in the morning because that's what he needed to do to support his family. Now, as trainers, as supervisors, we have a certain benchmark that we look at in terms of what is required for our students. And so no special dispensation for anyone because training is training. Okay? And yet, this is something that hadn't been factored into our thinking. He then, at the end of his M1, finished his training. He went to the hospital. He had a wonderful experience at the psychiatric hospital, I think Lenteghe it was, and then had a ComServe in Brighton, where there was a large xenophobic explosion, and he was targeted, and his children were almost killed. Now, while doing this, he's providing service for survivors of violence in the hospital there, but finding and not being able to be safe in the spaceship because he was a refugee. It was really hard to get a ComServe for him because ComServe is only for South Africans, right? Even though he had refugee status. Okay, so. And the final one is what we find here always, our students who really struggle. And we have two really wonderful cases of two psychologists who trained at our university, and they're just magnificent. But one, at that dinner when we went to eat, they very jokingly said that for the whole M1 till the middle of the M2, these students who lived at the hostel would every day have jam and bread in the morning and the afternoon, right? And when we'd ask them why, they say they liked it. But this is, and one was squatting in the other's room. But without any awareness, we had some awareness because one of them was selling socks, you know, all the time. He was very entrepreneurial, and the socks didn't last very long, but they were still socks. But he was trying quite hard to have a sense of dignity for himself, of being able to manage what he needed to manage, and this is pre-funding time. Now you can get NRF money, and even though you're on the rating committee, you need to get to the funding committee to make sure that the funds come for our students. But I think that's where part of the struggles are. And in terms of our research, there's the boundary vigilance. And this, I just want to raise one point around this. And this is around exploiting students' work for the academics' benefit. Now, Kupana, you spoke a little bit about how wanting to be sort of the psychologist that sits and quietly writes and produces, because it's a lonely job which one has to do, and at the same time how collegially, in trying to build a cohort of researchers in a research area, that we push together a African-centered or contextualized perspective in scholarship. Right? And in doing that, there are concerns about how we do that for our students. So when the students' work is being, they do their thesis, we make sure that they do a good job, and especially if they don't write well, then we write a thesis for them. Obviously it's their name and they pass. But when the name comes, who's the first author? The first author sometimes, if we see in our journals, is the academic, when it's not really their work. They've just put it together. Right? And everyone does acknowledge the student as a second author, and yet there's a different way that has to be that, of equalizing the relationship, of trying to make sure that those who do the work get noted for their work. Okay, and now, time up 5 minutes ago. Oh, 2 minutes, okay. Okay, so the final thing, what else can we do? And so, I now work in the International Relations Office, where two things stand out from the history on training. And one is that where we can, in training in psychology, we generally have we observed all the time. We observe what we do, what we're not doing, how we're training, how we should be training, and we also observe ourselves, because we are engaging with humans all the time, and that means that we respond to them, and we affect them, and we're affected by them. And in doing this, especially when there's a violence or societal dissonance, or whether it's just a crazy South Africa in the way that we've had the crooks for a while now, then the focus becomes very parochial, just about how to manage our daily lives, how to wake up, how to eat, how not to be thrown off track, to be able to make sure that we eat as students. And we have a food security issue at university. We know, like our two students from previously, from who trained at UWC, that students still don't eat here. They don't. They just isn't the food. And so there are systems that are being developed here to try and support students, but there's a sense that students really struggle. And in doing that, if we try and manage it, or manage just our daily lives of trying to not succumb to the despair that comes from prolonged oppression. It makes it very hard to look up and to look at possibilities, look at potentialities, look at the future that allows greater sense of growth, where one can dream and fly. And Kupano speaks about this always in his work. Look and be, create, do things, and fly. And I think one of the things that's certainly been helpful for me in my work has been about connecting with students to be able to say that they can do anything that they want to do. They'll have the support. They will have a platform, a springboard of other clinicians and other researchers, and that they can use these to be able to, and it's our job to put the wind under their wings so that they fly. And just to be able to make the contributions that they do. And for this, there's lots of funds now. I wish we had it then. There's a lot of funds now, but there's a lot of opportunity for international travel, collaboration of work, but connecting with mentors and people who are not necessarily South African or who are embedded in our way of doing things, but who also have a vision of of greater good that psychology can do for humanity than and elsewhere. So there are some more possibilities, and you can get my email. I'll send you the money. Okay. Thank you.